A starving German shepherd stood by a frozen lake in Pine Hollow, her ribs showing through frost-covered fur, her amber eyes locked on a silent Navy SEAL who had forgotten what warmth felt like as he placed food in the snow and stepped back. She didn't bark or beg, only watched him, then kept glancing toward the dark forest as if something more important than hunger was waiting there. That night, Ethan Walker thought it was nothing, just another quiet moment swallowed by winter. But the next morning, the tracks returned, and this time, they weren't alone. Two tiny sets followed behind, weak and unsteady. Clear's throat. When he followed them to an abandoned boathouse, he found her again, curled around two fragile puppies, barely holding on to life. In that moment, the man who had lost all faith realized something had been placed in his path for a reason. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Type your country in the comments below. At the end of January, Pine Hollow, Maine, seemed less like a town than a piece of the country the rest of the world had forgotten. A quiet settlement pressed between black pine forest, frozen shoreline, and long roads that disappeared under wind-blown snow before dusk had fully settled. And in that season, the lake became a sheet of hard gray ice that reflected no warmth at all, while the roofs of old homes bent under white weight and the few lights in town looked dim and far away, as if winter itself had pushed every living thing inward. Ethan Walker had chosen that place for exactly that reason, because silence there was not unusual, distance was not suspicious, and a man could exist on the edge of the woods without anyone asking too many questions, which suited him better than kindness ever had. He lived in a rented cabin beyond the last proper road, where the trees stood thick enough to break the wind only a little, and where each morning began with smoke, frost, and the sound of his own boots on wood, the kind of repetitive loneliness that did not heal a wounded man, but did give him a way to survive one more day without having to explain why he still carried the war inside him, like shrapnel no surgeon could reach. Ethan was 39, tall and broad-shouldered, built with the compact, disciplined strength of a man who had spent most of his adult life training his body to obey before fear had time to speak. And even now, far from any battlefield, he still carried himself with that same controlled posture, straight-backed, economical, watchful, as if the world might shift into danger at any second, and he would have to answer it. He wore a full U.S. Navy working uniform Type 3, the long-sleeve blouse and matching trousers in green AOR2 digital camouflage fitted the way standard issue always fit men who respected it, with brown military combat boots planted firmly beneath him, never careless, never soft. His face was angular and weathered, not old but carved by years of strain, with steel blue eyes that held too much restraint to be mistaken for calm, a short ash-brown beard touched lightly with gray, and a regulation military haircut that remained the same because routine was easier than choice. He had once been the kind of Navy SEAL other men trusted without hesitation, steady under pressure, cold when cold was needed, the last one to panic and the first one to move. But war had split something inside him without leaving visible ruin. And after one failed extraction in the Middle East, after one friend's hand had slipped from his grip while radio static swallowed the last of his voice, Ethan had returned home with all the pieces that mattered on paper and none of the ones that made life feel like life. He did not come to Pine Hollow to start over because starting over implied hope, and hope required more strength than he had left, so he came there instead to reduce himself to function, to live by tasks simple enough that they did not ask questions and silence deep enough that it did not offer answers. His days had the same order each time the sun rose over the frozen trees, because repetition dulled memory better than whiskey ever had. He split wood behind the cabin until his shoulders burned, checked the roof line for ice, repaired sagging fence posts that guarded nothing important, drove into town for canned beans, coffee, lamp oil, and dog-eared newspapers he never read, then returned before anyone in the general store could do more than nod. He did not linger, did not chat, did not let local curiosity harden into acquaintance. At night, he sat beside the iron stove while the fire threw dim orange shadows over the rough plank walls. And sometimes he slept, but more often he drifted in and out of old deserts, convoys, dust storms, and the memory of heat so violent it seemed impossible in a world now buried under snow. In those hours he did not feel like a man hiding in Maine, but like someone stranded between the man he had been and the one who had never come home. That afternoon the wind had sharpened, dragging loose snow across the lake road in long, pale streaks that looked like ghostly water moving over ice, and Ethan was driving his old truck back from town with a sack of supplies on the seat beside him, when he saw the figure standing near the tree line just ahead, motionless enough at first to resemble a broken fence post or some winter-blackened stump, half buried in drift. Then it moved, and the shape resolved into a German shepherd female, thin almost to the point of disbelief, her black and tan coat dulled by grime, frost, and neglect, her frame so gaunt that the ridge of her ribs showed clearly beneath the fur along her sides. She stood with one front leg slightly favored, not lifted, but protected, as if pain had become familiar and therefore unremarkable, and though her body showed exhaustion, her head remained level, ears alert, eyes fixed on the truck with a wary intelligence that made her look less like a stray and more like a creature who had survived by refusing to collapse in front of anyone. She did not bark, did not rush the vehicle, did not perform the desperate friendliness hunger often forced out of abandoned animals. She simply watched, amber eyes bright and steady, in a face narrowed by cold and hardship. And there was something in that look that struck Ethan harder than pity, because it was the gaze of something hurt but still responsible for more than itself. He pulled the truck over without fully deciding to, the habit of action stepping in before whatever remained of indifference could stop him. And for a few seconds he sat there with the engine idling, one hand on the wheel, studying her through the windshield as snow hissed softly across the road between them. Then he reached for a container of leftover meat he had bought cheaply in town, stepped out into the cutting air, and crouched far enough from her that he would not corner her, setting the food down near the exposed roots of a pine that leaned toward the lake. The cold bit through his gloves and uniform immediately, but he barely noticed it, because all his attention remained on the dog and the tension held in her body, the way she tracked every movement he made without losing control of herself. "Easy," he said, his voice low, not soft in any practiced way, only steady, the tone of a man who had once calmed wounded soldiers under fire and remembered that some living things responded better to composure than affection. He backed away several paces, leaving space rather than invitation, and after a long moment she moved, each step cautious, light and deliberate, lowering her muzzle to the food only after glancing once more toward him and then beyond him, toward the white emptiness near the frozen shoreline. When she began to eat, she did it fast, the speed of a body that had gone too long without enough. But even in hunger she was not wholly present with the food, because every few seconds she lifted her head abruptly and looked out across the drifting snow toward the lake and the darker stand of trees beyond it, as if there were something there she was measuring against time. Ethan noticed that immediately, because men trained to survive learned to read what others missed, and there was meaning in the rhythm of her fear, in the way she ate only just enough to keep going, and then checked the distance again, not like an animal afraid of an ambush behind her, but like one unwilling to stay away from something waiting elsewhere. Her muzzle trembled faintly when she swallowed, her coat along the shoulders was crusted with old ice, and there was a narrow raw patch near her flank where fur had thinned badly. Yet the strangest thing about her was not how broken she looked, but how stubbornly alert she remained, as if weakness had not been granted the authority to decide anything for her. Ethan felt an unwelcome stirring deep in his chest, not sentiment exactly, but recognition, because he knew what it was to keep moving on instinct alone when the rest of you had already shut down. When she finished, she did not come closer to ask for more, did not test his mercy, and that restraint lingered in his mind even before she had turned away. She stepped backward once, never fully taking her eyes off him, then pivoted and disappeared toward the lakeside path, her body fading into the shifting veil of white between the pines, with a silence so complete it made her seem part of the weather itself. And Ethan remained standing beside the road longer than necessary, staring at the place where she had vanished while the wind dragged icy grit against his boots. He told himself what he would have told anyone else, that this meant nothing, that winter drove strange things close to houses and roads, that there were countless abandoned dogs across the country, and one more would not alter the shape of the world. But what unsettled him was not the animal alone. It was the direction of her gaze and the way it had never fully left the lake. By the time he climbed back into the truck, his hands colder than before, he could still feel those amber eyes on him, not pleading, not trusting, only measuring whether he would matter. The drive back to the cabin passed under a sky that darkened too early, the snowfields turning blue-gray and the trees black as old bruises, and the whole time some part of his mind remained fixed on the dog's posture and the look she kept throwing into the storm, as if she had eaten only because survival required her to return to something more important than hunger. The cabin greeted him the way it always did, with cold corners, rough floorboards, and the faint smell of old smoke buried deep in the timber. And he moved through his routine with the same precise motions that had carried him through months of solitude, stacking wood, checking the latch, setting water to boil, laying out his supplies in neat order on the narrow counter. Yet each task felt slightly out of rhythm now, because another life had brushed against his and refused to remain abstract. Outside, the wind gathered strength, striking the walls in waves and rattling the window glass just enough to make the silence inside feel more exposed. And while beans heated on the stove and the fire settled into a steady glow, Ethan found himself looking toward the dark panes more often than he wanted to admit. He ate without tasting much, then sat in the old chair near the stove, forearms on his knees, staring into the coals while memory and instinct tangled in ways that made rest impossible. He thought of the dog's thinness, of the slight hitch in her gait, of the way her eyes had stayed alive even when the rest of her looked close to collapse, and beneath those details something else kept pressing forward, the sense that she had not wandered to the road for herself alone. He did not like such thoughts because they had weight, and weight led to responsibility, and responsibility was the first thread by which a man could be pulled back into caring. Night deepened early, swallowing the tree line and the frozen edge of the lake until the world beyond the cabin became a solid blackness, broken only by blowing snow and the pale smear of moonlight behind cloud, and Ethan had almost convinced himself that he would let the matter remain what it was when he heard the first sound outside, so faint that a less disciplined ear might have mistaken it for shifting ice, or a branch dragged across the porch by wind. He lifted his head immediately, every part of him going still, not startled, but sharpened, and listened until the sound came again, a soft scrape followed by a small compressed crunch in the snow just beyond the door. He stood, lantern in hand, and crossed the room with the same measured caution he had once used in compounds and alleyways thousands of miles away, though the thing waiting beyond the threshold now was not an enemy, only a question. When he opened the door, the cold entered like a living force, and the porch lay pale under blown snow, empty at first glance, except for a pattern of fresh tracks pressed into the drift nearest the steps. He raised the lantern slightly, and the warm circle of light widened across them. The larger prints belonged to the German Shepherd, unmistakable now in size and spacing, but beside them, crossing in and out of hers, were smaller paw marks, lighter, less steady, and so recent that their edges had not yet softened. Ethan stood there for a long moment while the wind moved around him and the lantern flame trembled faintly inside its glass, and something inside his chest settled into certainty with the slow, hard weight of truth rather than surprise, because those smaller prints confirmed what her behavior had already suggested. She had not come to that road only because she was starving, and she had not kept looking toward the lake out of ordinary fear. Somewhere beyond the dark shoreline or among the trees near the frozen water, there were others waiting for her, smaller and weaker, and all at once her caution, her restraint, and the urgency in her eyes became part of the same picture. He looked out into the blackness where the tracks vanished, and for the first time since arriving in Pine Hollow, his solitude no longer felt like protection, so much as distance between himself and something he might yet be forced to answer. The night pressed in around the cabin, the pines groaned softly under the weather, and Ethan closed the door only after memorizing the direction of the trail, because he already knew that when morning came, he would follow it. Morning came to Pine Hollow in a quiet, brittle stillness that followed the long night wind, the kind of silence that settled after a storm had passed, but before the world had fully decided to move again, and when Ethan Walker stepped out onto the porch, the air felt sharper, cleaner, almost glass-like as it cut into his lungs, while the frozen lake stretched out before him under a pale sky that held no warmth, only a dull, diffused light that made everything appear distant and untouched. The snow had stopped, leaving behind a fresh, even layer that captured every movement from the night before, with a clarity that was impossible to ignore. And as Ethan lowered his gaze, the tracks he had seen by lantern light now lay fully revealed in the morning. The larger paw prints firm and purposeful, the smaller ones scattered, uneven and fragile, pressed close to the bigger set, as though whatever made them had relied entirely on the strength ahead of it to keep going. He stood there without moving, tall in his full Navy working uniform, Type 3, the green AOR2 pattern blending into the dark line of trees beyond, his steel-blue eyes narrowing slightly as they traced the path outward, not with hesitation, but with the quiet calculation of a man who understood that once he started following, he would not be able to pretend he had not seen. He stepped down from the porch and into the snow, his boots sinking with a soft, controlled crunch as he aligned his path with the tracks rather than disturbing them. His movement instinctively precise, conserving energy, reading terrain, and the cold wrapped around him like something familiar rather than hostile, because it was easier to deal with physical discomfort than the kind that lived in memory. The trail curved gently away from the cabin, cutting across the open stretch between trees before angling toward the frozen shoreline. And as Ethan followed it, he began to notice more details. The way the smaller prints drifted erratically at times, occasionally collapsing into a shallow drag before picking up again, suggesting weakness, exhaustion, or youth. And once or twice they disappeared entirely for a short distance, only to reappear closer to the larger set, which told him that whatever made them had either stumbled or been carried for a time. That detail settled deeper than the rest, because it confirmed not only that there were others, but that the dog he had fed had not been acting for herself alone, and the realization moved through him slowly, not as emotion, but as something closer to responsibility taking shape before he could stop it. The path led beyond the last of the dense trees into a stretch of open ground where the wind had carved shallow ridges into the snow, and beyond that, partially obscured by a cluster of leaning pines, stood the abandoned boathouse, its structure barely intact, a relic of some earlier life along the lake, when the water had been used for work rather than silence. From a distance it appeared almost skeletal, the roof sagging under weight, the wooden planks warped and split, patches of frost clinging to its sides like old scars, and as Ethan approached, the sound of the wind slipping through its broken seams produced a low, hollow murmur that resembled breathing more than air, a constant exhale that made the place feel less empty than it should have been. The dock that led to it was half buried, uneven under his boots, and each step required balance rather than force. Yet Ethan moved across it without hesitation, his body adjusting automatically, his attention already shifting inward toward what waited inside. He reached the door and paused for only a second, not out of fear, but out of awareness, listening for any movement beyond the wood, any sign that the situation might be more than what the tracks suggested. And when nothing came except the soft whisper of wind, he pushed it open slowly, the hinges protesting with a drawn-out creak that echoed into the dim interior. Light filtered in through gaps in the walls, thin beams cutting across the space to reveal what remained of the building's past. Coiled fishing nets stiff with frost, broken crates stacked in corners, a torn tarp hanging loose from a nail, and scattered debris half buried under wind-blown snow that had crept in over time. The air inside was colder than outside in a different way, stale and unmoving, and Ethan stepped forward just enough for his eyes to adjust, scanning the shadows until they found what they had come for. In the far corner, where the walls met at a slightly more sheltered angle, the German Shepherd lay curled tightly around two small shapes, her body wrapped around them with a protectiveness that did not relax even in exhaustion. And when she lifted her head, her amber eyes locked onto Ethan instantly, alert despite the obvious strain in her posture. Up close, the extent of her condition was clearer, her coat thin and matted, patches of fur clumped with ice, her ribs sharply defined beneath her sides, and there was a faint tremor running through her limbs that spoke of fatigue deeper than a single night's hunger. Yet she did not attempt to flee or attack, only watched, measuring him again as she had before, but now with something added to that gaze, something that carried urgency rather than distance. The puppies were smaller than they had seemed from the tracks, fragile in a way that made their survival feel uncertain, their bodies tucked into her chest as if warmth alone could keep them anchored to life, one of them barely moving at all, its breathing shallow and irregular, while the other shifted weakly, pressing closer, its tiny frame trembling in a rhythm that matched the cold seeping through the structure. Ethan lowered himself slowly into a crouch, his movements deliberate and controlled, every shift in his weight measured so as not to startle or corner the animal in front of him, and he spoke again, quietly, not expecting comprehension, but offering steadiness, the same tone that had once cut through panic on a battlefield. The dog's ears flicked at the sound, her gaze unwavering, and for a few seconds nothing changed, the moment held in place by tension and exhaustion alike, until she exhaled, a long, shallow breath that seemed to release some part of her resistance, her head lowering slightly as if acknowledging that whatever came next was no longer something she could fight alone. Ethan recognized that shift immediately, because trust, when it came, rarely announced itself clearly, and he moved forward just enough to extend his hands, palms open, giving her the space to refuse if she chose to. But she did not move away. He reached for the first puppy, lifting it carefully, the weight barely registering in his hands, and the cold of its body cut through him more sharply than the air outside had, because it spoke of how close to the edge it had already come. And then he took the second, whose movements were slightly stronger, but still uncertain, and held both against his chest, instinctively shielding them from the wind that crept through the broken walls. The German Shepherd rose slowly to her feet, her legs unsteady, but her focus absolute, her eyes tracking every movement he made, yet she did not interfere, did not snap or pull back, only stayed close, her body angled toward the puppies as if ready to reclaim them if he failed to do what he intended. Ethan stood, adjusting his grip, and turned toward the door, already calculating the fastest route back, the distance, the time, the risk of exposure. And as he stepped outside, the dog followed without hesitation, her presence close behind him like a shadow bound by something stronger than instinct alone. The return to the cabin felt longer than it had on the way out, not because the distance had changed, but because what he carried now required care rather than speed, and Ethan moved with that balance, steady but urgent, his boots cutting a new path through the snow while the wind began to rise again, carrying with it the faint warning of another shift in weather. The puppies remained pressed against him, their small bodies gradually warming under his coat, and he could feel the faint movement of breath against his chest, uneven but present, and behind him The dog kept pace, her gait uneven but determined, never falling back, never breaking the line between them. By the time the cabin came into view, the light had shifted again, the sky dimming slightly as clouds gathered overhead, and Ethan pushed the door open with his shoulder, stepping inside quickly to trap what warmth remained before crossing directly to the fire. Inside, the air felt almost stifling after the cold, but he did not slow. Kneeling near the stove and placing the puppies onto a folded blanket, he pulled from the nearby chair, adjusting it quickly to create a pocket of heat, his movements efficient, precise, guided by something that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with instinct he had not used in years. The German shepherd entered moments later, hesitating only briefly at the threshold before stepping inside, her body tensing as the warmth hit her, and she shook once, scattering bits of melting frost before moving directly to the puppies, lowering herself beside them and curling her body around theirs again, though now the tension in her posture had shifted, less defensive, more focused on recovery. Ethan stood back slightly, giving her space, his eyes watching the interaction with a quiet intensity, noting the way she nudged them gently, the way her breathing slowed as she confirmed they were still alive. And something in that small, contained scene held his attention longer than it should have. It was not long after that when the knock came, firm but unhurried, carrying through the cabin with a presence that was neither urgent nor uncertain, and Ethan rose immediately, his posture shifting back into that controlled readiness as he moved toward the door and opened it to reveal Walter Brennan, the older man standing with the patience of someone who had long ago learned not to rush moments that did not require it. Walter was in his early 70s, shorter than Ethan by several inches, his frame slightly bent but not fragile, his shoulders wrapped in a thick wool coat worn smooth at the seams, a knit cap pulled low over thinning gray hair, and his face lined deeply with age, not harshly, but with the kind of marks left by years of work, loss, and quiet endurance. His eyes were pale blue, steady and observant, and there was a calm in them that did not come from ignorance, but from having seen enough to recognize when not to ask questions. In his hands he carried a metal container, steam rising faintly from its edges. "Maine winters don't forgive men who forget to eat," Walter said as he stepped inside without ceremony, setting the container down on the table with a small nod, his voice rough but even, carrying a dry tone that suggested humor lived there somewhere beneath habit. His gaze shifted quickly to the corner where the dog and puppies lay, and for a moment he simply watched, taking in the details without comment, his expression tightening slightly at the sight of their condition, though not in shock, more in recognition. "Looks like something found you," he added after a beat, glancing back at Ethan, the faintest hint of a knowing look crossing his face. Ethan gave a small shrug, not dismissive, not explanatory, and Walter did not press further, instead removing his gloves and resting his hands briefly on the table as if grounding himself in the warmth of the room. "They tend to do that," Walter continued, nodding toward the animals. "The ones that are hurting, they don't waste time on people who won't help." And there was no accusation in his tone, only a statement delivered with a kind of certainty that suggested experience rather than theory. He moved a step closer to the fire, not too close, not intrusive, just enough to feel the heat, and then added quietly, "Funny thing is, they're usually right about who they pick." Ethan did not respond, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle tightening that Walter noticed without acknowledging, because men like him did not need words to recognize when something had landed where it needed to. After a few minutes, he straightened, pulling his gloves back on. "Soup's clam chowder," he said, almost as an afterthought. "Figured it might remind you what real food tastes like." And with that, he made his way back to the door, leaving as simply as he had arrived. When Walter was gone, the cabin settled again into its quiet. but it was no longer the same quiet Ethan had known before, because it now held the soft sounds of breathing not his own, the faint shifting of the dog as she adjusted around her pups, the small, fragile movements that signaled life holding on. Ethan returned to his chair near the fire, sitting forward slightly, his forearms resting on his knees as he watched the scene without interruption, the firelight casting long shadows that moved across the walls and over the shapes on the floor. Outside, the sky had darkened fully, the lake disappearing into a black expanse broken only by drifting snow. And as the hours passed, the storm that had threatened earlier began to build again, wind rising in low, steady waves that pressed against the cabin walls. It was during that deepening night, when the fire had burned low and the room had settled into a fragile calm, that Ethan heard it, faint at first, then clearer as he turned his head toward the window. A distant engine moving slowly along the road near the lake, the sound deliberate rather than passing. And when he stood and stepped closer, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see, he caught sight of an old pickup truck moving at a crawl through the darkness, its headlights dimmed, its presence lingering longer than any traveler would have reason to remain. The truck slowed near the stretch of road that led toward the boathouse, paused just long enough to feel intentional, then continued forward before stopping again further down, its engine idling low as if whoever sat inside was not simply passing through, but watching, waiting, or searching. Ethan remained still, his eyes fixed on the fading shape as it eventually disappeared into the dark, and something in his chest shifted again. Not fear, but recognition of a pattern he knew too well, because not everything that moved in silence was harmless, and not every story that began with something helpless ended that way. In the days that followed, Pine Hollow did not change in any visible way. The snow still lay thick across the lake, the pines still stood heavy and unmoving beneath their burden, and the sky remained a dull ceiling of pale winter light. Yet inside Ethan Walker's cabin, something shifted in a way that could not be measured by weather or time, because where there had once been only the controlled silence of a man avoiding his own thoughts, there were now small, uneven sounds threading through the air, the faint shuffle of paws across wood, the soft, irregular breathing of something fragile trying to hold on, and the low, steady presence of a life that no longer existed solely for itself. Ethan noticed the change not all at once, but in fragments, in the way he woke earlier without the weight of dread pressing immediately on his chest, in the way his eyes moved first toward the corner near the stove instead of the door, and in the quiet awareness that the cabin was no longer empty in the way he had built it to be. The German shepherd recovered slowly, her strength returning not in leaps, but in subtle adjustments, the tremor in her legs easing first, then the tension in her posture, though she remained cautious, her amber eyes following Ethan's movements constantly, never fully surrendering her instinct to guard, yet no longer seeing him as a threat. He named her Sadie without thinking too much about it, the word coming naturally in a moment when she lifted her head toward him as if expecting something more than silence. And once spoken, the name stayed, settling into the rhythm of the cabin as though it had always belonged there. The puppies, whom he named Rusty and June, were different in ways that revealed themselves quickly. Rusty slightly larger, his coat marked with a faint reddish tint along his chest, more restless even in weakness, while June was smaller, quieter, her movements slower and more deliberate, as if each step required a decision she was not yet strong enough to make easily. Ethan found himself adjusting to them in ways that felt unfamiliar but not uncomfortable. The same hands that had once checked weapons and bandaged wounds now steadying a trembling pup, lifting June when she struggled to stand, or nudging Rusty gently away when his curiosity pushed him too far beyond his strength. And there were moments, brief and unplanned, when something like a smile moved across his face, not broad or careless, but enough to break the rigid line he had carried for months. He noticed it most when Rusty latched onto the loose end of his bootlace, tugging with a determination far larger than his body, or when June, despite her weakness, insisted on dragging herself a few inches closer to Sadie rather than accepting the distance. And in those moments, Ethan felt something shift inside him, something that had been dormant long enough to feel foreign, yet not unwelcome. Sadie watched everything, her behavior a careful balance between trust and vigilance, and while she no longer flinched when Ethan moved near her, she still positioned herself between him and the puppies whenever he reached too quickly, her body language quiet but clear. And Ethan respected that boundary without needing to think about it, because understanding unspoken limits had once been the difference between success and failure in a very different kind of environment. At night she slept closer to the fire now, her breathing steady, her body no longer coiled tightly around her pups. And sometimes, when Ethan shifted in his chair, she would lift her head briefly, meet his gaze, and then lower it again without tension, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than any trained obedience could have. Walter Brennan became a regular presence without announcing himself as such, his visits spaced just far enough apart to seem incidental, yet frequent enough to establish a pattern, and each time he arrived, he carried something simple, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, a jar of preserved vegetables, another pot of soup that smelled faintly of the sea and wood smoke, and his manner remained the same, quiet, observant, never pressing, never intruding beyond what Ethan allowed. Walter's physical presence told its own story, the slight tremor in his hands when he removed his gloves, the stiffness in his steps that suggested joints worn down by years of labor, and the occasional cough he tried to suppress, a dry, persistent sound that lingered longer than it should have. Yet his eyes remained clear, steady, and when he spoke, it was always with the kind of calm certainty that came from having already lived through more than he needed to explain. It was during one of those visits, when the wind had risen enough to rattle loose boards along the side of Walter's house, that Ethan followed him back after noticing the sag in the older man's porch roof, the wood warped and partially torn where ice had gathered and broken free, and without discussion he set to work reinforcing the beams, his movements efficient and silent, while Walter remained nearby, offering tools, making small comments that were less about instruction and more about presence. Inside the house, the difference between the two men became more visible because Walter's home, though worn, carried the remnants of a life once shared, photographs lining the walls, a faded quilt folded neatly over the back of a chair, and a small table near the window where papers had been stacked carefully, though not carefully enough to hide what lay among them. Ethan saw it without meaning to, a letter placed beneath a folded newspaper, the edge of it visible enough to reveal the printed heading, a formal notice regarding overdue property taxes, the kind that did not come without consequence, and even from a distance he understood what it meant. The timing, the urgency, the quiet threat, embedded in the language of institutions that did not negotiate with circumstance. Walter noticed his gaze almost immediately, his reaction subtle but unmistakable, the letter sliding out of sight beneath his hand, with a movement that was practiced enough to suggest this was not the first time he had hidden it, and when he spoke again, his tone remained unchanged, though something beneath it tightened just slightly. "Old houses take more from you than you expect," he said, as if that explained everything and nothing at the same time. Ethan did not ask, did not comment, because he understood that some things, once spoken aloud, could not be returned to silence. Back at the cabin, the days continued their slow progression, but the pattern now carried an undercurrent that had not been there before, because Ethan began to notice things beyond the immediate needs of the animals, small details that did not belong to the natural rhythm of Pine Hollow. The tracks near the lake had not been completely erased by wind, and once or twice he found new disturbances along the old road leading toward the boathouse, impressions not made by animals, but by tires, shallow but recent, cutting through snow that should have remained untouched. The memory of the truck from the night before lingered, and now, combined with these signs, it formed a pattern he could not dismiss as coincidence. He did not act on it immediately, but he began to watch more carefully, his attention shifting outward again, the instincts he had buried resurfacing not as tension, but as awareness. At night, when the fire burned low and the cabin settled into its fragile warmth, Ethan sometimes found himself standing by the window, looking out across the frozen lake, where darkness stretched unbroken to the far tree line. And there were moments when he thought he saw movement, not clearly, not enough to confirm, but enough to keep him from turning away too quickly. Sadie seemed to sense it before he did, her behavior shifting in subtle ways, her ears lifting more often, her body tensing briefly before relaxing again, as if she recognized something in the distance that Ethan had not yet fully identified. Once she moved toward the door without prompting, her posture alert but controlled, and stood there for several seconds before returning to the puppies, a silent indication that whatever she sensed had not crossed into immediate threat but remained present enough to matter. The connection formed slowly in Ethan's mind, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility that refused to leave, because the condition Sadie had been in, the location where he had found her, and now the presence of an unknown vehicle near the same area, suggested a history that extended beyond abandonment, something structured, something deliberate, and the thought that she might have come from a place where animals were used, confined, and discarded when no longer useful settled heavily in him, not as anger, but as a cold recognition of how easily such things could exist unnoticed. He did not say it aloud, but the idea shaped the way he watched her now, the way he noticed the faint scars along her flank, the way she reacted to sudden movement, and the way her vigilance never fully disappeared, even in rest. That night the wind rose again, stronger than before, pressing against the cabin with a force that made the structure groan softly in response, and Ethan had just settled into his chair when Sadie's body shifted abruptly, her head lifting, ears sharp, her entire posture tightening in a way he had not seen since the boathouse, and a low, controlled growl built in her chest, not loud, but steady, directed toward the window that faced the lake. Ethan followed her gaze immediately, rising without hesitation, moving toward the glass with the same quiet precision that had once defined his life. And when he looked out, at first he saw nothing but the shifting snow and the dark line of trees beyond, until a faint movement caught his eye, a thin beam of light sweeping briefly across the frozen surface, distant but unmistakable, moving slowly, deliberately, as if searching. He stood there, watching as the light moved once more, then disappeared behind the trees, leaving the darkness intact but altered, and beside him Sadie's growl did not fade immediately, her body remaining tense, her attention fixed outward as if confirming what he had just seen. Ethan did not speak, did not move away, because the quiet had changed again, no longer empty, no longer neutral, and as he stood there, the reflection of the fire flickering faintly in the glass, he understood with a clarity that did not require explanation that whatever had followed those tracks, whatever had brought Sadie to his door, had not yet finished with them. The storm rolled into Pine Hollow by late afternoon with the kind of silent authority winter in Maine reserved for its worst moods, the sky lowering first into a bruised gray and then into something heavier, something that seemed to press down on the frozen lake and the dark tree line until the whole world looked as though it were being slowly buried alive. And Ethan Walker felt it long before the first hard wave of snow struck the cabin windows. Because the air had changed, the wind had sharpened, and Sadie had not settled once all day, moving from the stove to the door, from the door to the window, her amber eyes fixed too often on the direction of the abandoned boathouse for Ethan to ignore what his own instincts had already decided. He stood near the table in his full Navy working uniform Type 3, shoulders squared, jaw set, his steel blue eyes narrowed toward the darkening glass, while Rusty and June slept in a folded blanket near the fire, their small bodies finally carrying enough warmth and weight to look less fragile than they had a week ago. And yet the tension in the room made him feel as though the peace inside the cabin had become something temporary, borrowed, and already being approached by men who had no right to it. He made the decision the way he made most serious decisions now, without ceremony, without discussion, simply by moving once the picture in his mind had become clear enough to act on, and within minutes he had checked the truck keys, pulled on his brown combat boots more tightly, shrugged into a heavier field jacket over the green digital camouflage, and loaded a flashlight and a flare gun into the pocket of the old canvas bag by the door. He crouched once beside Sadie, who stood tense but steady, her body angled between him and the puppies in a protective reflex that had not left her even after trust had grown between them. And he spoke in that low, even tone she had learned to follow, telling her to stay, telling her to keep the pups close, his hand resting briefly along the side of her neck where her winter-thickening fur had begun to soften again. She did not whine or pace when he rose, only watched him with that fierce, intelligent stillness that made her seem less like an animal obeying and more like a partner understanding an assignment. And when he opened the door, the first wall of snow hit him hard enough to sting the skin across his face. The road toward the lake had already begun to disappear under drifting white by the time he reached it, and Ethan drove slowly, headlights low, shoulders tight with concentration, as the truck tires searched for traction beneath fresh accumulation, while beyond the windshield the world broke apart into moving snow, black tree trunks, and brief glimpses of the gray ice field where the storm swept across the lake in ghostly streaks. He parked well short of the boathouse, killing the engine and listening for a moment to the silence that followed, because silence always carried information if a man knew how to hear it. And what he heard now beneath the wind was movement, not animal movement, not the random crack of branches under ice, but the irregular thud of men shifting weight on old wood and the muted clang of something metallic striking a wall or crate. He stepped out and moved through the storm with the reflexive economy of a SEAL who had spent too many years advancing through bad terrain toward worse intentions, using the trees and the angle of the wind for cover, until the dark shape of the boathouse emerged ahead, and voices, rough and impatient, cut through the weather in fragments. The two men inside were the kind Ethan recognized immediately, not because he had known them personally, but because he had seen their type in every place where power met something helpless, men with thick, careless bodies and faces shaped by appetite more than thought, men who mistook cruelty for authority because it was the only kind of control they had ever managed to hold. The taller one, broad across the shoulders and wearing a stained canvas coat over a thermal shirt stretched tight across a belly that had grown from too many winters spent drinking rather than working, had a red beard gone patchy around the chin and a voice like sandpaper dragged across wood. The other was leaner, younger by perhaps 10 years, with a narrow fox-like face, small, deep-set eyes, and nervous hands that kept tugging at the cuffs of his gloves as if his own skin annoyed him. Ethan remained outside the broken wall long enough to hear what mattered. "She couldn't have gotten far with the litter," the taller man muttered, kicking aside an old crate, and the other answered, "Marlowe said if we bring back the female and the pups before the county boys start sniffing around, he'll pay double. Folks pay real money for shepherd bloodlines if they're young enough." Then the tall one laughed without humor and added, "Should have put the chain on her sooner. Didn't think a pregnant bitch had that much fight left." The sentence landed in Ethan with a cold clarity that anger never really reached, because anger was hot and messy, and he had spent years learning how to survive by staying colder than the men across from him. But the picture formed instantly now. Sadie in some makeshift breeding place deep in the woods, confined, used, discarded the moment her suffering became inconvenient, then escaping while pregnant and dragging her failing body through winter to keep two lives inside her alive. Ethan shifted position and let a piece of loose siding strike against the outer wall, drawing both men toward the opening, and when they moved, he stepped back into the blind angle of the storm, forcing them to come outside if they wanted answers. "Who's out there?" the lean one shouted, his voice cracking just enough to show he was braver with animals than with uncertainty. And when Ethan did not answer, the taller one cursed and came off the dock with a flashlight and a tire iron in his hand, beam jerking wildly across the snow. Ethan waited until they were far enough from the doorway, and then moved, not rushing them, not wasting motion, striking the tall man first with a hard blow to the wrist that sent the tire iron into the snow, then driving his shoulder through the man's chest to put him down on the frozen dock planks, before pivoting toward the second, who swung clumsily and caught only air as Ethan stepped inside the arc, seized his jacket collar, and slammed him against the side wall hard enough to knock the breath from him. The fight did not last long because most fights outside movies ended quickly when one man knew exactly how to use pain, terrain, and surprise. But the danger did not end with the first impact, because both men were desperate, the kind of desperate that came from people serving someone meaner than themselves. And as the taller one struggled back upright, cursing and spitting blood into the snow, he shouted something about the dog being worth more than the wrecked shack. And that was the moment Ethan understood they would keep moving toward the cabin if he let them think they had any chance of reaching it. So he changed the field, stepping backward deliberately into the storm and forcing them to follow, baiting their anger away from the boathouse road and toward the tree line where visibility broke apart and footing turned treacherous, using shouted taunts sparingly, just enough to keep their pride engaged. Behind him, the snow swallowed his boot prints almost as soon as he made them, and he knew Sadie would hold her position with the pups because trust between them had become more than feeding and shelter now. She had learned his rhythms, his voice, the meaning of wait, and in the cabin she would keep Rusty and June pressed into the safest corner near the stove until he came back, or until the walls themselves failed. What Ethan had not counted on, though perhaps he should have, was Walter Brennan's particular brand of stubborn concern, because while the storm thickened over the lake road, the old man had seen unfamiliar headlights crawl past his property again, and had done what lonely, decent men often did when worry outweighed common sense. He had taken action alone. Walter's old pickup, a faded blue Ford with rust along the wheel wells and an engine that always sounded as if it were apologizing for staying alive, had no business being out in weather like that, not with the lake road icing over and visibility dropping by the minute. Yet Walter drove it anyway, his thin shoulders hunched inside a flannel-lined coat, one gloved hand tight on the wheel, and the other clutching a cell phone that had already lost most of its signal after he managed to leave a broken emergency report with the county dispatcher. Ethan first heard the truck before he saw it, the engine revving too high and then slipping, and when he broke through the tree line toward the road, he caught sight of it at once. Headlights skewed at a terrible angle as the vehicle fishtailed near the embankment and slid nose first toward a snow-filled drainage ditch beside the frozen edge of the lake. For one sharp second, everything narrowed into movement, storm, distance, and choice, and Ethan made it across the road just as the passenger side dipped violently, the truck leaning far enough that another foot might have rolled it deeper into the ditch. Walter was inside, jaw tight, pale face drawn with effort but not panic, still trying to correct the wheel like a man too proud to surrender to physics, and Ethan yanked the door open against the drag of wind and snow, grabbing Walter beneath the arm and hauling him out as the truck groaned and shifted lower. "You picked a hell of a night to go sightseeing," Ethan shouted over the storm, and Walter, even half breathless and shaken, managed the ghost of a grim smile when he answered, "Didn't figure I'd enjoy the view if those men reached your place first." Behind them, one of the thugs emerged from the storm with the flashlight beam cutting sideways across the road, and the other followed, limping but still angry, only to freeze when Walter, coughing into his sleeve, lifted the phone and shouted that county deputies already had their location. It was not entirely true in the practical sense because signal had died almost at once, but it was true enough in spirit, and that hesitation, that tiny crack in their certainty, gave Ethan the space to close the distance and disarm the taller man again before he could swing anything more dangerous than his own temper. The deputies arrived not quickly, but quickly enough, their lights flashing dim red and blue through the storm like something unreal moving across the buried road, and by then the two men were on the ground, one cuffed with his own zip ties that Ethan had taken from the boathouse, the other too winded and frightened to make a second bad decision. Deputy Nora Bell stepped out first, a compact woman in her 40s with a square jaw, windburned cheeks, and the clipped, efficient manner of someone who had spent too many winters managing other people's bad judgment. Her dark hair was braided tight under a county cap, and her voice carried none of the softness of reassurance, only competence. She took one look at the scene, at Walter shivering but upright, at the two men swearing in wet snow, and then at Ethan, whose uniform and composure told their own story, and said only, "You can give me the order later, but I'm guessing these two didn't come out here for ice fishing." When the men started talking all at once, denying, deflecting, naming a man called Marlowe, mentioning dogs and money and property that was never theirs, Nora's expression changed only enough to become colder, and within minutes the pieces had aligned into charges serious enough to remove them from Pine Hollow's roads before dawn. By the time Ethan got Walter back to the cabin, the storm had fully claimed the night, snow curling around the porch light in bright, frantic spirals, while inside the warmth hit them in a wave that smelled of wood smoke, broth, and damp fur. And Sadie rose at once from her place near the stove, not barking, not panicking, simply moving forward with a controlled urgency to check Ethan first and then Walter, while Rusty and June stirred in their blanket nest with the sleepy confusion of creatures too young to understand danger once it had passed. Walter lowered himself into the chair by the fire with the slow wince of age and overused bones. Ethan draped a blanket over his shoulders, and for a long moment nobody said much, because the room itself had changed, and all three living souls inside it seemed to feel that change at once. The cabin was still small, still drafty, still one winter storm away from being just another rough shelter in the Maine woods. Yet, as Sadie settled beside her pups, as Walter accepted a mug of reheated chowder with shaking hands, and as Ethan stood between the stove, the door, and the people now gathered in that narrow square of light, the place no longer felt like a hideout. For the first time since he had come to Pine Hollow, it felt like a home. The storm passed the way hard things often do in Pine Hollow, not with a clear ending, but with a gradual easing, the wind loosening its grip on the trees, the snow settling into quieter drifts along the lake road, and the sky lifting just enough to let a thin, pale sunlight spread across the frozen surface like something hesitant to return. And in the days that followed, the cabin that had once held only the controlled silence of Ethan Walker began to carry a different kind of life. Not loud, not chaotic, but steady, layered, and warm in ways that could not be mistaken for anything temporary. The air inside no longer felt like a place between moments, but a place where moments stayed, where the sound of Rusty's uneven paws tapping across the floor, the softer, careful steps of June as she followed behind him, and the low, grounding presence of Sadie resting near the stove, formed a rhythm that Ethan did not try to resist anymore, because somewhere between the storm and its aftermath, he had stopped thinking of their presence as an interruption and started recognizing it as something that had quietly rebuilt the space around him. Walter Brennan became part of that rhythm without asking for it, his visits no longer spaced by chance, but by intention, the old blue truck arriving more often in the late morning when the sun had climbed just enough to soften the cold along the road. And each time he stepped into the cabin, he carried with him the small, practical habits of a man who had lived long enough to understand that care did not need to be announced to be real. He moved slowly, his joints stiff from years of work and the strain of recent cold. But there was a quiet persistence in him that didn't bend easily, and while his cough lingered now, dry and stubborn, he brushed it aside the same way he brushed aside most discomfort as something to be endured rather than discussed. He showed Ethan how to stretch a meal without losing its warmth, how to turn simple ingredients into something that felt like it mattered, how to keep a fire steady through the night without wasting wood. And while he spoke, he often drifted into stories, not in a deliberate way, but in the natural rhythm of memory rising to meet the present. Eleanor Brennan appeared in those stories not as a figure preserved in grief, but as someone still woven into the shape of Walter's life, a woman who had been strong, in the way quiet people often are, steady, patient, and unafraid to speak when something needed to be said. And Walter described her not through grand moments, but through small, enduring ones, the way she had insisted on planting flowers even in poor soil, the way she had kept the house alive with simple routines, the way her absence had not emptied the rooms, but had changed the way silence moved through them. "It's not the bones that hurt the most when you get old," Walter said one afternoon as he stood near the window, watching Sadie and the pups in the yard, his voice softer than usual, but still even. "It's the part of the house that stops hearing someone call your name." And Ethan did not answer immediately, because the truth in that sentence settled somewhere deeper than conversation, somewhere that had not been touched in a long time. Ethan's own changes came without announcement, the same way all his decisions came now, quietly, through action rather than declaration, and over the following weeks he found himself driving into town more often, not out of necessity alone, but because there were things to ask, things to learn, and people he no longer avoided as strictly as before. The local veterinary clinic sat near the edge of Pine Hollow's main street, a modest building with weathered siding and a hand-painted sign that had faded slightly with time, and inside it was run by Dr. Sarah Whitaker, a woman in her early 40s with a lean frame, dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail, and sharp hazel eyes that missed very little, her movements quick but precise, her voice carrying both authority and an undercurrent of compassion shaped by years of treating animals in conditions that were rarely ideal. Sarah had grown up in a neighboring county, had left for veterinary school in Boston, and had returned not because it was easier, but because she understood that places like Pine Hollow needed people willing to stay. When Ethan first brought Sadie and the pups in, Sarah did not ask unnecessary questions, but her gaze lingered long enough on the scars along Sadie's flank, on the condition she had been in, and on Ethan himself, to understand more than what was said aloud, and while she examined the dogs with practiced care, her tone remained calm, direct, and respectful of the quiet boundaries Ethan carried. "She's strong," Sarah said after a moment, her hand resting gently along Sadie's side as the dog stood still beneath her touch. "Stronger than she should have had to be." And when she looked up at Ethan, there was no judgment in her expression, only a simple recognition that whatever had brought the dog here had also brought him with her. She offered to handle their care without cost, brushing it off when Ethan hesitated, saying only that not everything in a small town needed to be measured in money. And in that moment, Ethan felt something shift again, because he was beginning to see a pattern, not of obligation, but of quiet choices made by people who refused to let things break if they could help it. Back at the cabin, life continued to take shape in ways that no longer felt fragile, and Sadie, now stronger, moved with a calm confidence that had replaced the constant tension she had carried when Ethan first found her, her body still lean but no longer hollow, her coat thickening against the fading winter, and her trust in Ethan no longer something measured, moment by moment, but something settled, steady, and present in the way she allowed him to move freely among her pups without hesitation. Rusty grew into his restless nature, chasing shadows across the floor, tugging at loose fabric, and testing every boundary with a stubborn curiosity that made Walter laugh more than once, while June, though still smaller, gained strength in quieter ways, her steps more certain, her gaze more focused, her loyalty to Sadie unwavering as she followed her mother with a determination that did not require noise. It was during one of those quieter afternoons, when the light outside had begun to soften into something that hinted at the coming shift in season, that Ethan made a decision that had nothing to do with immediate need, and everything to do with something larger he had not yet named. And instead of confronting Walter directly about the letter he had seen, instead of offering help in a way that would have been refused, He chose a different path, one that aligned more closely with the kind of action he understood best. He sat at the small table in the cabin, a notebook open in front of him, and for a long time he did not write, because words had never been his primary tool, but when he began, he did so with the same clarity and precision he had once used to report from the field, except now the subject was not a mission, but a man. He wrote about Walter Brennan as he had come to know him, not as a figure of sympathy, but as someone defined by quiet endurance, by the kind of decency that did not seek recognition, by the act of bringing a hot meal to a man who had made himself unreachable, and by the simple, unspoken understanding that sometimes saving someone did not look like rescue at all. He wrote about Sadie as well, about the night she had stood in the snow, about the journey that had nearly broken her, and about the way she had chosen to trust when survival no longer required it. And when he finished, he sent the story not to a single place, but to several: the local Pine Hollow Gazette, a regional veterans network in the Northeast, and a small online community dedicated to animal rescue. And then he closed the notebook and returned to his routine without expecting anything in return. What followed did not happen all at once, but it did not take long either, because Pine Hollow was the kind of town where stories traveled faster than weather. And within days, people began to respond. Not loudly, not publicly at first, but in the way small communities often did, through quiet acts that built upon one another until they became impossible to ignore. A group of local carpenters, men who had known Walter for years and respected him without ever saying it directly, showed up at his house with tools and lumber, repairing the damaged porch, reinforcing the roof, and replacing broken siding before he could argue against it. Someone from the town council arranged for a private fund to be set up, contributions coming in without names attached, enough to cover the overdue taxes without making Walter feel like he had been reduced to charity. And Sarah Whitaker, along with a few others from the clinic, ensured that Sadie and her pups received everything they needed, not as a favor, but as a continuation of something that had already begun. Ethan watched all of this unfold with a quiet awareness that didn't need explanation, because he understood now that there were forms of action he had never been trained for, battles that did not require force, only presence, only the willingness to step forward first and allow others to follow. And in that understanding, something inside him settled into place that had been out of reach for a long time. He did not speak about it, did not frame it as change, but the fact that he remained, that he continued to move through the town, to speak when needed, to listen when it mattered, was enough to show that whatever had brought him to Pine Hollow no longer held the same meaning it once had. By the time the first cracks appeared along the surface of the frozen lake, thin, dark lines spreading slowly beneath the weight of warming days, the season had begun its quiet shift, the air carrying a faint softness that had not been there before. And along the edge of the cabin roof, small droplets of water began to form and fall, steady, patient, marking time in a way that no calendar needed to confirm. Ethan stood outside one morning, the light brighter now, the snow less absolute, and watched as Sadie moved across the clearing with Rusty bounding ahead and June following close behind, their movements no longer tentative, no longer marked by survival alone, but by something freer, something closer to what they had been meant for before everything had gone wrong. He remained there for a long moment, hands resting loosely at his sides, his posture no longer rigid in the way it had once been. And as he watched them move through the thinning snow under a pale early spring sun, a thought formed quietly, without force, without resistance, and for the first time since he had arrived in Pine Hollow, it did not feel like a question he needed to avoid. It felt like an answer he was ready to accept, that this place, this cabin, this life that had grown around him piece by piece was no longer something he had come to escape into, but something he could stay in, something he could begin again within. Spring did not arrive in Pine Hollow with sudden warmth or dramatic change, but with a slow, deliberate softening that touched everything at once. The heavy snow receding first from the edges of the lake, the dark water beneath the thinning ice beginning to show through in long, fractured lines, and the air losing its sharp bite as the wind shifted from something that punished to something that simply moved. And Ethan Walker noticed these changes the way he noticed most things now, not with urgency, but with quiet attention, because the world around him no longer felt like something he needed to endure, but something he was allowed to observe again. The cabin, once a place of controlled isolation, now carried the marks of use, of life, of presence, the wooden floor worn slightly by movement, the corners filled not with silence, but with small, constant activity. And outside, the clearing had begun to open, patches of earth showing through where the sun lingered longer each day, creating a space where winter no longer held full authority. Sadie moved through that space with a presence that had changed in ways more profound than simple recovery. Her body now strong and balanced, her coat thick, clean, and carrying the natural sheen of health rather than the dull weight of survival, and her amber eyes no longer held the distant vigilance Ethan had first seen beside the frozen road, but something steadier, calmer, a kind of peace that did not come from forgetting what had happened, but from no longer needing to be defined by it. She still watched everything, still measured movement, still positioned herself instinctively between the cabin and the open forest when something unfamiliar stirred. Yet there was no tension in it anymore, only awareness, and when she rested near Ethan or lay beneath the porch as the afternoon light stretched long across the ground, her posture reflected not readiness for flight, but the simple acceptance of being where she had chosen to remain. Rusty and June had grown into themselves in ways that made their early fragility almost difficult to imagine. Rusty taller, stronger, his reddish markings more defined, his energy boundless as he chased movement across the clearing, testing the limits of distance before circling back, always returning, always checking. While June, though still slightly smaller, carried a quiet resilience that had deepened with time, her steps now confident, her movements purposeful, her bond with Sadie unbroken, yet her attention increasingly drawn to Ethan as well, following him as he moved from the woodpile to the shed, from the shed to the edge of the forest, as if she had decided that whatever path he walked was one worth learning. Together they formed a rhythm that extended beyond instinct, something shaped by choice as much as nature, and Ethan found himself moving within that rhythm without resistance, adjusting his pace, his routines, even his thoughts to include them without needing to force the change. Walter Brennan's presence remained steady, though time had not reversed its hold on him, his movements still careful, his reliance on the old wooden cane more constant now. Yet there was a lightness in him that had not been there before, a quiet return of something that had been lost along with the years and the silence that followed them. His house, once showing signs of slow surrender to neglect, now stood reinforced, repaired, its structure holding firm against the lingering chill of early spring, and he spent his days between his own porch and Ethan's cabin, moving with deliberate purpose, offering advice, sharing stories, and sometimes simply sitting in companionable quiet as the dogs moved around them. He spoke more often of Eleanor now, not with the weight of absence, but with the ease of someone who had found a way to carry memory without being crushed by it. And there were moments when he would pause mid-sentence, glance toward the lake or the trees, and smile faintly, as if recognizing something only he could see. Ethan had thought at first that when Sadie recovered fully, when Rusty and June grew strong enough to survive without shelter, he would let them return to the forest, not as abandonment, but as respect for what they were, for the life they might reclaim beyond human structure. And for a time he held to that idea, watching as Sadie ventured farther from the cabin, leading her pups along the tree line, guiding them through terrain that still held traces of the harsh winter they had endured. Yet each time, no matter how far they went, no matter how long they remained out of sight, they returned, not hesitantly, not out of necessity, but with a quiet certainty that made their choice unmistakable. Sadie stepping back onto the porch as if crossing a boundary she no longer questioned. Rusty bounding ahead toward the door, June following close behind, their presence settling once more into the space that had become theirs as much as his. Ethan recognized the meaning of that pattern slowly, not as a realization forced upon him, but as something that unfolded naturally over time because he had spent too long believing that everything rescued must eventually leave. That attachment required distance to remain intact, that care could not exist without eventual separation. Yet Sadie's behavior told a different story, one that did not rely on instinct alone, but on trust freely given and freely returned. She had not been bound to him, had not been confined or conditioned to stay, and yet she chose to remain, not out of dependence, but out of recognition. And in that choice, Ethan found something he had not expected to understand, that not all bonds required release to remain true, that some were strengthened by presence rather than tested by absence. The decision to stay in Pine Hollow, to remain in the cabin, not as a temporary refuge, but as something more permanent, formed in Ethan without resistance, the same way all his decisions formed now, quietly, through action rather than declaration, and once it settled, it carried with it the next step as naturally as breath. The old storage shed behind the cabin, long unused and partially collapsed under years of neglect, became his focus, and over the following weeks, he repaired it with the same methodical care he had once applied to missions, reinforcing its frame, replacing damaged boards, clearing space inside until it could serve a purpose beyond storage. Walter assisted where he could, offering tools, advice, and the occasional stubborn insistence on doing more than his body should allow, while Sarah Whitaker stopped by more than once, checking on Sadie and the pups, her quiet approval evident in the way she nodded at the changes taking shape. The idea grew not as a grand plan, but as a continuation of what had already begun, a small space for animals like Sadie, for those abandoned, injured, or left behind in the wide stretches of forest and forgotten roads that surrounded Pine Hollow, a place where survival could shift into recovery, where fear could ease into trust, and where something broken could be given time to become something whole again. Ethan did not speak of it as a mission, did not frame it as redemption, but he worked on it each day, shaping the space with a clarity that required no explanation. And when Walter offered the use of the adjacent strip of land near the lake, his voice casual but firm in its intention, Ethan accepted not as a favor, but as a shared decision, something that belonged to both of them now. By the time the town gathered for the small fundraiser, the air had warmed enough to carry the scent of damp earth and early growth, the lake no longer fully frozen, its surface broken into shifting sections of ice that moved slowly with the current beneath, and the clearing near the cabin held a handful of people, neighbors, workers, familiar faces that had once existed at a distance, but now stood close enough to form something like a community. Walter stood beside Ethan, his posture supported by his cane but his presence steady, his gaze moving across the gathering with a quiet satisfaction that did not need acknowledgement. And when he reached out and placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, the gesture carried more weight than any words could have, though he spoke them anyway, his voice low, measured, and certain. "Some people," Walter said, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the last of the ice drifted apart, "aren't sent to stay with us forever. They're sent to pull us out of the dark just long enough so we remember how to walk on our own." Ethan did not answer immediately because the meaning of those words did not require response, only recognition, and as he stood there, the light of late afternoon stretching across the clearing, Sadie resting at his feet, Rusty and June moving in loose circles nearby, their energy boundless and free, and Walter beside him like something closer to family than neighbor, he allowed himself to look forward in a way he hadn't done in years. The wooden sign at the edge of the clearing, newly set into the ground, caught the fading sunlight as it read, Brennan Ridge Rescue, the letters simple, carved by hand, but solid, permanent in a way that reflected the choice behind them. And in that moment, Ethan understood with a clarity that did not waver that the winter that had brought Sadie to him had not been an ending disguised as hardship, but a beginning he had not been ready to recognize until now. At the end of this journey, what remains is not just the image of a rescued dog or a soldier finding peace, but a quiet truth that many of us overlook in our own lives, that sometimes the miracles we pray for do not arrive as light from the sky or sudden change, but as something fragile placed gently in our path, something that asks for nothing at first except that we notice it, that we choose not to walk past it, and that we allow our hearts to open just enough for God to work through us in ways we do not fully understand. Ethan did not set out to save anyone. He did not believe he was worthy of being part of anything good again. Yet God placed Sadie in his path, not only to be saved, but to save him in return. And through that simple moment, through that one decision to stop, a life that had been frozen began to move again. A home was rebuilt, a lonely man found family, and a broken place became a place of healing for others. This is the kind of miracle that does not demand attention, but changes everything. The kind that reminds us that God often sends us what we need in forms we do not expect, through people, through animals, through moments that seem small, but carry something far greater inside them. And if we are willing to listen, to act, and to trust, we may find that we are not just receiving a blessing, but becoming one for someone else. In our everyday lives, we pass by so many chances to be that light, to help, to care, to step in when it would be easier to stay silent. And this story asks us one simple question. What if the miracle someone is waiting for is you? If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment and tell me what part moved you the most, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue spreading stories that remind us of faith, compassion, and second chances. And tonight, as you rest, I pray that God watches over you and your family, that He brings peace to your heart, strength to your struggles, and light to every dark place you are facing. If you believe in this message, if you believe in quiet miracles and in the power of faith, type Amen in the comments.